Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
All right, so we have two articles that I found that are really interesting to chat about. The first one kind of flew under the wire, no pun intended, because it's from Wired magazine here, and it talked about satellites and unencrypted data that's flowing through it. And so I saw this article, read through the whole thing, really interesting. A team of researchers at the University of San Diego and the University of Maryland revealed in a study that roughly half of the geostationary satellite signals are basically vulnerable to eavesdropping. They're running unencrypted communications through them. So some of them might be carrying consumer, corporate, or government communications. And so for the last 3 years, this team has been developing and using an off-the-shelf $800 satellite receiver that they put on the roof of the university building in San Diego, and they were able to pick up communications of these satellites in a small band that's visible to their Southern California vantage point. And from just literally pointing their dish at different satellites and spending months interpreting those signals that were completely unprotected, they were able to amass a pretty alarming amount of information. They were able to get samples of phone calls, text messages from like T-Mobile cellular network, data from airline passenger in-flight Wi-Fi browsing, communications to and from critical infrastructure such as electrical utility and offshore oil and gas platforms, and U.S. military and Mexican military law enforcement communications that revealed locations of personnel, equipment, and facilities. They titled their presentation, which is they're presenting at a conference called Don't Look Up, which is a reference to a Netflix film in 2021. If you haven't seen it, it's a phenomenal movie. You should actually go and see it. It's about like the end of the world type stuff. But they called it Don't Look Up because it's kind of like describes the cybersecurity strategy of these people who design these systems is like, don't ever look and go and check, because if you did, you're going to find that all the stuff is unencrypted. So that was the method of security, is like literally just don't look at it. It will be okay.
Trust us.
So they did spend the last year warning companies and agencies that they found exposed. So that's good. And most of them, including T-Mobile, which I'm a customer of still. And Adam, I think you're a customer of as well.
I am. Yep.
And so like I was like, okay, well, these companies, let's do something about it. And so a lot of them did quickly move to encrypt the communications and protect the data, but then there were some that did not. And so they declined to name those companies to Wired, obviously, but there are some that still have to yet add encryption to their satellite-based systems. The researchers looked at only a small fraction of the satellites that they could pick up, which is roughly 15% of those that are in operation. But just based on their small sample, it's pretty obvious that there's a vast amount of data that's still being exposed over satellite communications. And a lot of this stuff is going to be vulnerable for years. As we know in tech, it takes a long time, right? And I can't even imagine having to launch new satellites or replace communication systems for this. It's probably going to be a long time before this stuff gets, replaced to secure these outdated systems. Now, I have a camper van that I use Starlink on. And so naturally, I was curious to see, because with the new administration and Elon and how he was kind of buddy for a while, there were a lot of government contracts, especially for U.S. government and military, that actually started using Starlink. And I know a lot of law enforcement as well use Starlink for their communication. So I was just curious, is Starlink encrypted? And based on just the cursory research, it is ISO 27001 certified, PCI compliant. So it does have end-to-end encryption on their network. So that was reassuring, I guess. And so
by the way, Starlink is not geostationary, if you want to be super technical. So as they continue to point out, these are geostationary. Starlink is not. It's in low Earth orbit. And so there's actually different satellites that are always coming in and out of range as you're using the service. It relies on having that fleet of satellites throughout the sky to provide coverage because they don't stay in one spot in the sky at all times.
Good call out there. Yeah. So the phone calls and text messages that this team obtained were exposed due to telecoms often overlooking the use of satellite communications for offering cellular coverage to normal phone users who connect to cell towers in remote locations. This was new to me, and the operations of it is kind of transparent to the regular cell phone user. I did not know that a lot of cell phone companies actually kind of run their signal. So like what happens is in some of these towers in desert and mountainous regions, you'll connect to a satellite that relays the signal to and from the rest of the telecom's core cellular network, the internal communications of the network, known as the backhaul traffic. And so a lot of telecom companies do this, and I didn't realize it. And so
they frequently use microwave signals, which can go long distances as long as you have point-to-point line of sight between more than one. So that's the way they do a lot of rural, as opposed to having to run fiber all the way to the middle of nowhere, Iowa or whatever. They'll do microwave, but in some locations it may be too remote to even do microwave signal, or you mentioned mountainous locations, you may not have line of sight, and thus you just are going to rely on geostationary satellites to accomplish that. Makes sense. Even if I didn't know about it, it does make sense with current technology.
And so like, to the regular user, you have no idea that your communications might be traveling over satellite communications. And so anyone who's setting up a satellite receiver in the same region can pick up these signals. And so by doing so, the research team was able to get a ton of unencrypted backhaul data from carriers like T-Mobile, AT&T Mexico, and Telmex. The T-Mobile data, they said, was particularly significant. In just 9 hours of recording T-Mobile backhaul satellite communications from their single dish, they were able to collect phone numbers of more than 2,700 users, as well as phone calls and text messages that the researchers received during that time. Now, one note of distinction, they said, was that they could only hear or read one side of those communications because the contents of the message and calls sent to those remote towers and not sent to them to the core cell network would have to have another satellite dish near the one T-Mobile intended to receive the signal on the other end. The Mexican telecom Telmex also transmitted unencrypted phone calls, and they discovered that AT&T Mexico transmitted raw data over satellites that included user internet traffic, most of which is encrypted by HTTPS. So like, as most of us do know, or maybe you don't, but it's worth mentioning that like pretty much 99% of internet traffic is encrypted by HTTPS. So there's that whole TCP handshake that happens. And so you are having a secure channel when you're communicating with a website, but your DNS traffic is generally not encrypted. Many people do not run encrypted DNS or secure DNS or whatever you want to call it. So that is generally in the clear. So you can at least see like what sites people are visiting and build a profile that way. And you can also get texting metadata and calling metadata. So, and then what's most concerning is they did find some decryption keys on this AT&T Mexico network that they believed could have been used to decipher some other information from the AT&T network in Mexico, but they didn't try it because that would have been maybe a felony of some sort.
Right.
So, to note that they didn't see any unencrypted Verizon and AT&T U.S. traffic from their dish, but it was only 15% of the satellites that they had.
Well, 15% of the global footprint. Certainly, they could have seen Verizon or AT&T traffic if it was there. Based on the United States, right? If generally speaking, geostationary satellites serving the contiguous United States would be visible from Southern California. So when they say that 15%, they're just saying like satellites targeting the Southern Hemisphere, targeting Asia or Europe or Oceania, wherever. But I mean, as far as the United States goes, they should have been able to see pretty much any satellite servicing the United States from their location. So, I mean, just to put that in context, it's 15% of global geostationary satellites, but probably the ones in the United States they could see pretty fully. And one thing to point out here, the T-Mobile data they were able to collect was a lot of metadata. They were able to see like calls that were set up. They obviously could see text messages because those are unencrypted. SMS is not an encrypted protocol. By the way, neither is RCS unless you have Google end-to-end on both ends. Like RCS messages sent through an iPhone are not encrypted.
Not
But
yet,
it sounds like the T-Mobile voice calls were, because they made a point to point out that the AT&T, or was it the Telmex calls were the unencrypted voice calls. So at least, some of it was, but still wild.
Yeah. And, like if you're using end-to-end encryption, that stuff won't be able to be seen either. So like iMessages, Signal messages, WhatsApp, if you're using like a WhatsApp call, those are end-to-end encrypted as well. So FaceTime. So, there are some mitigations just based on the technology and the communication security that we have today based on what you're using. But obviously, there's still a ton of unencrypted traffic when it comes to cellular stuff, like DNS traffic for sure, SMS text, for sure.
A lot of metadata, just again about calls set up, the call being set up from this phone number to this phone number. Even if the call itself is encrypted, that's probably not.
Yeah, and they were also able to see a lot of military and law enforcement. So like for U.S. military sea vessels, so the ones, our Navy obviously has a lot of satellite communications based on just being out at sea. They were able to see unencrypted communications from there as well as the vessel names. For the Mexican military and law enforcement, it was far worse, they said. They were able to see unencrypted communications with remote command centers, surveillance facilities, units of the military, Mexican military and law enforcement. And in some cases, they saw a transmission of sensitive intelligence information on activities like narcotics trafficking. So, not great. The researchers restricted their equipment to only off-the-shelf satellite hardware, like total cost $185 for a satellite dish, $140 for a roof mount, $195 for a motor, $230 for a tuner card, which all in total was less than $800. And they're basically, this is not like NSA type resources. This was like a direct TV level resource. So the barrier entry to get this type of equipment is extremely low. And, some of the security researchers were basically saying that there's no doubt that intelligence agencies with vastly superior satellite receivers have been analyzing the same unencrypted data for years. And I think the NSA did actually, in the article, I didn't go and read it, but the NSA had put out like a warning back in 2022 that warned about unencrypted satellite data. So, all this to say is the threat model that we should be using today is encrypt everything. Like that should be the threat model that we're using. So if you're somehow using satellites within your organization and you
might not even know.
You might not know. Yeah, it's true. We should be encrypting everything. So like if you're somehow using or some other system, that's the way that we should go today. Encrypt everything. If you're using satellite data, you should be aware that this is currently the situation and that we need to do better and start moving towards encrypted channels for that.
This is not tinfoil hat stuff. And maybe a couple of years ago, it could have felt like that. But it is no longer tinfoil hat. It's no longer conspiracy theories. It is reality that there are a lot of unencrypted signals out there. And so you should do your part to encrypt everything you can control and ensure you're using encrypted services, that your organization is set up to use encryption 100% of the time, to Andy's point, because you just honestly, you don't know what it's traversing over. Andy, you have in the rundown here, the governments are tapping undersea fiber optic cables, or they're coercing internet telecom companies to let them sniff the data. You just have to assume, and it is not a big leap, it is not a big assumption that something somewhere is being eavesdropped. So encrypt everything. It's no longer a flying car, it's reality.
It's funny. I just literally had this thought in my head when we say encrypt everything. Like there is, when it comes to like certain things, right? But like I wouldn't recommend like a company encrypt all of their emails. Like there's a mindset of like encrypting like channels so that you're not able to sniff things, but like you don't want to like say encrypt at the data level everything to make it harder for your users. So like that just popped into my head when we said like encrypt everything. Like
we're talking in transit, not at rest,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Obviously, you should have some basic data at rest encryption, like high level at the system or silicon level. Yes. So I'm talking BitLocker or File Vault or something to that nature. We're not talking necessarily using a data security platform like a Microsoft Purview and encrypting everything. Although I will say, and if you, Andy, I don't know if you've talked to any folks in that realm recently, but that guidance has even shifted over time as well. Whereas it used to be like, do not encrypt everything by default. Don't go crazy. Just encrypt the most sensitive stuff. And that has kind of shifted. I mean, look at how, by the way, Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales. We do the show outside of work on our own time, self-fund the show, and our opinions do not represent the opinions of Microsoft Corporation. That said, at work, the Purview setup today now is basically anything you put in your OneDrive, encrypt by default.
Yeah.
If you put in OneDrive, encrypt by default. So that's a difference in stance versus where it was a couple of years ago. But I don't want to go way down that tangent tonight. This was all about data in transit. And I think we are clear on that. Like absolutely encrypt everything that is in transit, encrypt all those channels, communications channels as much as you possibly can, and be aware of when they're not. And this is why we talk about things like we need to get rid of SMS based two-factor authentication. We need to get rid of voice phone calls as a two-factor method because we just don't know. It's outside of our control how that is or is not being protected. So that's where we take it within our control and we use means we know are encrypted channels.
Okay, so this next story was all the rage this last week. I saw it all over LinkedIn. I saw it all over the security news. And so I just wanted to talk about it because it's super interesting. So Anthropic, which is an American AI startup company, they developed a large language model called Claude. So you probably heard of them if you're in, looking at AI. They released a blog and information on a threat actor that was attributed to a Chinese state-sponsored actor who deliberately manipulated their Claude code tool with the intent of infiltrating roughly 30 global targets, which in a small number of cases that it actually succeeded. So a little bit of backstory. They wrote in the article here. In mid-September, they started detecting some suspicious activity that they later determined to be a highly sophisticated espionage campaign. The attackers used AI agentic capabilities to an unprecedented degree. They used AI not just as an advisor, but to execute the cyber attacks themselves. They targeted large tech companies, financial institutions, chemical manufacturing companies, and government agencies. And Anthropic believes that this is the first documented case of a large-scale cyber attack executed without substantial human intervention. And so we're going to go into some of the details of that, but the campaign had some substantial implications for cybersecurity in the age of AI agents, which are systems, we've talked about AI agents here on the show before, but they're ones that can run autonomously for long periods of time, that can complete complex tasks and largely independent of human intervention. So when they detected the activity, they launched an investigation for it. They banned a bunch of accounts that they identified as malicious. They notified the affected entities, and they coordinated with law enforcement authorities as needed. But, all to say is AI, of course, has been revolutionary a lot in the area of cyber operations specifically. But unfortunately, it's both for good and for evil in this case. And so going into some of the details of how this attack ran, the reason why it even was possible was because the attack relied on a lot of features that really did not exist or were not fully developed about a year ago. The level of intelligence that the models have today have increased to the point where they can follow complex instructions and then understand context in ways that make these sophisticated tasks possible. And they also have several well-developed specific skills like software coding that lend themselves to be useful in these attacks. Models can now act as agents, so they can run in loops and take autonomous actions. Agents wasn't a big thing like a year ago. It was just the whole prompt and receive a response. And so they can chain these tasks together. They can make decisions with minimal or just occasional human input. And then the tools have largely grown in the last year. So like the open standard model context protocol, which we talked about on this show, the tools can now search the web, they can receive data, they can perform other actions that were previously usually the sole domain of human operators. And in the case of cyber attacks, the tools can also include like password crackers, network scanners, and other security related software. So Anthropic did a really good job of mapping out the life cycle of this attack. And so I was like super interested in like seeing how it was actually done. The human operators chose the targets. They developed a framework and then developed these agents to target using Claude Code as the automated tool. And then they tricked Claude. So Claude has guardrails built in specifically to prevent malicious activity. And we've talked about maybe a little bit on like the whole like how do you prompt poisoning and jailbreaking and all this other stuff, and how do you get them to do that. And so this was actually super interesting on how they actually tricked Claude by bypassing those guardrails that were put in place. They broke their attacks into small, seemingly innocent tasks that Claude would execute without being provided the full context of their malicious behavior, which is oftentimes how a lot of jailbreaking stuff happens. Like I can't say like, hack Adam Brewer's Gmail, but I could maybe say, tell me a story of if I were to try to hack Adam Brewer's Gmail, how would I do that? Right. And so like there's ways that you can trick it, I mean, obviously like that's probably not going to work in this case, but I'm just saying like there are ways to like do that. And that's what they did here is they broke it down into like little chunks where they knew the end result, but the AI didn't know their whole intent, and they were able to circumvent those guardrails. They told Claude that they were an employee of a legitimate security firm, and then they were doing some defensive testing. And then they told the Claude Code to inspect the target's organization systems and infrastructure and spotting high-value databases. Claude was able to perform the reconnaissance in a fraction of the time, and it was reported back a summary of its findings. And then they used Claude to identify and test those security vulnerabilities in the target's organization systems by researching and writing its own exploit code. The framework that was used to develop to use Claude was able to harvest credentials, username and passwords, then was able to laterally move, harvest more information. The highest privileged accounts were identified, backdoors created, data exfiltrated, all without very minimal human intervention. And then they had Claude produce a comprehensive documentation of the attack. That this is just, it's kind of brilliant. They had please summarize the attack for us and create helpful files of the stolen credentials and systems analyzed, which would then assist the framework in planning the next stage of the attack. Anthropic said overall, the threat actor was able to use AI to perform 80 to 90% of the campaign, with human intervention required only sporadically, perhaps 4 to 6 critical decision points in the hacking campaign. And then also to note, Claude didn't always work perfectly. It occasionally hallucinated credentials or claimed to have extracted secret information that was in fact publicly available. So this is still, at least I guess fortunately, but it obviously happens on the defensive side, or anytime you're using AI, this is an obstacle, right? When AI hallucinates or makes up information that states that as fact. I'm sure we've all encountered that when using AI. It's still a big thing that happens, and it prevents it from being completely autonomous at this point. So once those kinks are hammered out, look out. So, and this is in general a fundamental change in cybersecurity. Like, we're advising organizations to experiment with applying AI in defenses like security operations, threat detection, vulnerability assessment, incident response, and also make sure that if you're developing AI platforms that you're trying to put these safeguards in. Our understanding of how attackers are breaking these safeguards will hopefully translate to us making the platforms much better. And what I will say, and I can't give out any public information, but Microsoft Ignite is this week free to sign up for an online version. There are some huge announcements coming. Adam and I got a pre-brief of some of the things that are coming down the pipe, not for public release. Of course, we will always do our post-Ignite show and summarize all the security things that were of note, but pay attention because there's going to be some huge announcements that are coming down for this that will hopefully help the defenders in this type of fight.
Yeah, a lot of really good cybersecurity stuff. I'm actually shocked how much cybersecurity stuff they held for Ignite this year. Typically, we try to do our biggest releases actually at the RSA conference. I think the announcements at Ignite will overshadow anything we announced at RSA this year. Just sometimes that's the nature of development, is that's when it lands, and there's a lot of good stuff coming. So stay tuned. When this episode drops will be 7 a.m. Central Time on Tuesday, will be Tuesday, November 18th, which is the first day of Ignite. So if you're getting this podcast bright and early Tuesday morning, you can still catch the keynote later today. If you've catching it a little later in the week, depending on when in the week it is, you can maybe already go browse the news and check it out. And then we'll do our, as Andy mentioned, our highlight show specifically on the cybersecurity announcements soon. Probably next week, I would imagine, Andy.
Yeah.
We don't want it to get too old. So most likely within the next week, we'll hit that. So looking forward to that as always, but it sounds like a bigger deal than ever. Going back to everything you just unpacked with this Claude cybersecurity thing, I'm reminded of back in the earlier 2000s, kind of the heyday of Texas Hold'em poker after Chris Moneymaker won the 2003 World Series of Poker, and everyone thought they were a poker genius and was playing poker online on all the different poker sites. And you could actually make money doing that. In fact, I made several $1,000s when I was in college. Tabling is what it was called. The thing is, most people playing online really didn't pay attention to their opponents. They weren't really following what actions they took in any given hand. And most people were honestly terrible at poker. So if you had any clue what you were doing, you could just sit at 4, 6, 8 tables at the same time. And for the most part, this would never work in real life. But online, again, people weren't paying attention. You could just fold every hand that was garbage, and you could just wait till you got dealt a good hand, and then you could play it, and someone would probably call you and lose a pot to you. And so the point that stood out to me here as you're walking through this is human intervention was required only sporadically, about 4 to 6 critical decision points per hacking campaign. So that reminded me of multi-tabling, which was similar. There were only a couple of critical decisions I'd have to make where I'd have to decide, do I call this big bet? Do I fold? Do I go all in? But for the most part, I could just fold, each hand until I got a good one. And I was able to play 6 or 8 tables at once. It's not hard to imagine human attackers can now have agents running 20, 30, 50 attacks at once, and they're just monitoring them. And when a decision point, an inflection point comes up, those 4 to 6 to 8 critical moments, the human can make a decision based on it while the agents are operating autonomously. And so what this does is yet again flips that scale where attackers only have to be right once, but defenders have to be right all of the time. It's only going to make it harder. And I am not a Chicken Little sky is falling kind of person, but this is kind of like I said in our first story, not a flying car. This is a real thing. This is a real threat today. And we need to be prepared to operate more than ever at machine speed and protect and defend at machine speed, because the attackers have an exponential advantage, especially when they start using agentic capabilities where they don't need to watch all the mundane stuff. Kind of like me folding the boring hands. If I got 10 deuce offsuit, I wasn't playing it. They can pay attention when you get dealt a pair of aces or an ace king and go play that hand. And that's what they're doing. They're effectively multi-tabling like I did 20 years ago, but cybersecurity attacks instead. And they only have to be right on one of them to hit a payload, maybe commit a human-operated ransomware campaign from there, maybe exfiltrate data and hold it ransom, demand a payday. It's not difficult to imagine how you could turn this into either, if you're a nation state, creating major damage or advantage for your organization or your nation, but also someone who just wants financial rewards, they could use this as well. So we have to get out of this mindset that Humans have to be involved in every step of the way because we have an asymmetrical disadvantage moving forward. And again, I am not a Chicken Little. I am not a sky is falling, but this is more than ever an asymmetrical threat that the attackers are winning right now and are only going to win more as they take more advantage of this technology. And as many of these models are trying to build these guardrails in them, think about what else is going on. We have continued development of open source models. We have things like DeepSeek and Llama, and think of the silicon that continues to ship, the state of the art of silicon, where the Snapdragon X series is going to have the Snapdragon X2 ship next year. Incredible silicon for PCs. Apple's now up to M5, the 5th generation of their Apple Silicon, which is an incredible local AI processing platform. People can still go buy a buttload of NVIDIA GPUs and chain them together and run LLMs locally as well. So even as the Anthropics and the Microsofts and the OpenAIs of the world try to protect against malicious use of these models, more and more of them can be run offline. There continues to be open source development. It's cat and mouse game. And the attackers are really clever and really smart. And so if nothing else, your takeaway here is as you are doing your security engineering, as you're doing your security operations, and you find an operation that is human speed bound, meaning it requires a human response to remediate, you need to be looking for ways to move that to machine speed and scale. Otherwise, you will lose. We will all lose. And so that's the threat we're up against. So we need defense that operates equally as fast. And that doesn't mean go AI all the things for defense. It means we need things like automatic attack disruption, where disparate portions of our security defense can talk to each other. And as they see high confidence anomalous events, can break the attack downstream so that the attacker cannot move further laterally or cannot gain more access in the environment. And if it requires human intervention, it's too late. So I'm off my soapbox. That's my piece for tonight. But we always say, give something actionable to our listeners. The action you need to take is you're looking for machine response.
Yeah, I remember at one of the companies where we were like manually reviewing the phishing emails that were submitted through like Cofense or something, like Fish Me or something like that. And they would send it to an inbox, and then like we would go in and review and say, okay, this one's spam and this one's, not malicious. It was a lot of like people just were on like email lists and they were like hit it as phishing. And then we'd have to go and review that. And you're talking thousands of emails per day. And, now we have an agent that can do that. And so like what you're saying is take anything that requires like that amount of human labor and speed, like that's where AI comes in and is a force multiplier, right? It's, it will.
I know that sounds like a salesy marketing word, but it's true. That's what it needs to be. AI has been a force multiplier for us doing this podcast, Andy.
Yeah.
In terms of helping us add captions, which we originally didn't have, helping us edit the show better than we could ever do by hand, where it cuts out the ums and the ahs and the pauses and makes it run really tight and really smooth. It was an insurmountable amount of human work. It would have never happened. In fact, the video used to not be heavily edited because it just would take too long. And now with AI, it's a click of a button. Mute everyone who's not talking, change the camera angles regularly, cut out ums and ahs and pauses. It's check, check, check.
It can even
Force
take
multiplier.
the eyes, right? And like if they're not at the camera, it can like change it to that. And that kind of weirds me out a little bit.
I don't use that. It's kind of creepy. So
it is creepy.
I tried it and it looked really weird, but it does exist. Yes.
Yeah. And like I would say, like, just to give it an idea, it's like it used to take me anywhere between 3 to 6 hours to edit an episode. I argue that if you do listen to those ones that I hand edited, they were still better than what AI can do today.
Yes, they were. Yes.
But AI does it in 10 seconds,
and it's good enough. It's still really, and it's gotten better. Like when they first came out with the ums and ahs, I didn't use it because it didn't sound right. It sounded really artificial. And now today it even mixes in. Sometimes it mutes us. Sometimes it's a cut, depending on what's going to deliver the best response. And so it's continually improved. And so there have been things where we've tried it and we're like, okay, I don't like that yet. And then we come back to it again and like, okay, this is good. It's amazing how fast it's evolved, even how much it's improved. But our recording platform has saved the two of us hundreds, maybe even thousands of hours over the 5 years we've been doing this show now. So, is there some stuff, AI stuff, that's way out there in the future and the hype curve is ahead of the current state of the technology? Absolutely, yes. Are there things that can deliver real value and benefit today? Also, yes. And so, is every attacker using Claude to commit these attacks? No. But are more coming? You bet they are. And this is how you protect yourself.
Yep. All right. Well, that was a banger of a show there.
As promised, Andy.
So thanks for watching and listening as always. That's our show for this week. Our contact information as well as the links. If you want to read these two articles, I highly recommend it. They will be in the show notes. Take a look for yourself. If you have any questions or comments or topics you want us to talk about in the future, please reach out to us. Our contact information will be in the show notes. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.